Hey everybody, welcome back. Today's video is a Pride Month lab, but I want to start off by saying this is not just a rainbow logo corporate pride thing, all right? I'm not usually somebody who makes a big deal out of pride or being a lesbian in general because honestly, who I love and sleep with, none of your business. But right now, there is a lot happening around the LGBTQ community, especially with the youth. And I think it's worth talking about out loud to bring some attention towards it and to honestly offer some assistance and people who might want to donate, all that kind of stuff. Now, in the US, LGBTQ youth make up a pretty small percentage of the overall population, about anywhere between 7 to 10%. However, they make up about 40 to 45% of homelessness. All right. This can be for a variety of reasons. A lot of it happens because they come out or they get outed, and the people, their families who were supposed to protect them, just kind of toss them out on the curb. Um, and once someone is out on the street, it's just a unfortunate and honest fact of the matter that everything just gets more dangerous for them. There's more violence, there's more exploitation, even fewer safer adults, and honestly, nowhere to go. Now, that is why pride matters, okay? Not because everything is fixed, not because we won, because we surely didn't, but because people are still trying to survive, protect each other, and build a safer community. I'm going to put some links, as I said, in the description to organizations that do some real work in these spaces. Now, whether you want to donate, volunteer, or help or need help yourself, please check it out, because the more awareness we bring to people who are struggling and to people who have these deeply unfortunate situations, the more that we can help them and the more that we can change the world, I guess. Now, for a LGBTQ nonprofit, a lot of people are going to talk about how I don't see why you're doing this. Like, what does this have to do with cybersecurity? Are you just doing it for the gimmick? And I'm going to be honest and say no, all right? There is a lot of different reasons for cybersecurity breaches, right? As we know. And for an LGBTQ nonprofit, a leaked spreadsheet is not just embarrassing, it can actually put people in real danger. Now, that is the idea for this lab, okay? And we're going to investigate basically a fake nonprofit called Rainbow Bridge Community Center, after this possible account takeover. What we're going to do is just walk through the evidence, figure out what happened, and then kind of talk about how one compromised account can turn into this much bigger, more dangerous situation. Now, I'm sure the first question on everyone's minds after I said all that is, why would anyone even target an organization like this? What benefit could there possibly be? So we're going to talk about that. Data. That's the easiest answer. Data. All right, guys. Small nonprofits like this do not look like big targets to us because either we're not a part of the community or, quite frankly, we don't really utilize the services. But they often hold a lot more information that is extremely sensitive than you might think. Okay, donor records, members list, finance details, event plans, even volunteer information. That's the kind of data that can be used for fraud, harassment, doxing, or even just straight up intimidation. So when one account gets compromised, it's not just this tiny little IT issue, it is actually a privacy breach, and it can become a really big safety risk because not only is it damaging to the organization and the ability for these vulnerable people to trust that they have their best interests at heart, but also because, let's say, I'm going to just go off script for a second and give you a hypothetical. Let's say my parents didn't know, and I go seeking services about, understanding my sexuality better, getting some off the side three therapy, processing my trauma as a person, and someone goes in and they do this big leak of the clinic that I was at. Well, now my parents know. So now my parents throw me out. And now I'm a prostitute. It's about that simple. When you toss someone on their butt, like I mean straight on their butt, into the street, you cannot be surprised what they are willing to do to survive. And quite frankly, some of the things that I have witnessed and some of the things that I have even heard about secondhand are pretty messed up. And nobody should ever, and I mean ever, have to go through that. There's no reason for it. And there are douchebags in the red pill community and in a bunch of other communities that do things like this to hurt LGBTQ folk and to, quite frankly, just spread mass hysteria and this whole paranoid situation about, making it to where the people who these services are for can't actually utilize them because they're afraid that people are going to know and that it's going to cause problems with their life, which it shouldn't. But that's the life that we live, and that is the situation that we always find ourselves in. So, again, that's why we have Pride. And let's kind of move on and talk about what is really on the line in this lab and kind of talk about the details as to how all of this starts. Now, in most cases, it's going to start with one email. All right. Rainbow Bridge is basically planning a Pride fundraiser, right? And a finance volunteer gets what looks like a normal vendor invoice. They're going to open it, they're going to interact with it. And after that, the environment is going to start acting a little weird, right? You're going to see some failed login attempts, then a successful login from somewhere. And after that, a weird app gets approved. Now, you're going to see some changes in these documents, and we'll talk about a lot of what you're going to see signals wise. But what I'm really here is just to answer the whole question of, was this actually a break in, or are we just looking at some random noise that I created to make you think? To answer that, we're going to need the evidence and we're going to have to actually talk about the lab kit a little bit. So let's get into it. So, nice thing about this lab is that everything is in fact local. You do not need Splunk, you do not need cloud admin access, and you do not need a paid tool. Everything you need is going to be inside this lab kit. So what you'll do is just work with the 8 files that you kind of see listed here. Now, don't worry about like memorizing all of them. The slides are going to tell you, which file is which and kind of tell you how to open it up as we go. The important part is just the order. So in terms of investigations, let's talk about why order matters. Now, the way order matters and why we move this through this the way that we do is because we want to first make sure that we are primarily preserving our evidence. And then once we do that, we verify that there's no changes, we build a timeline, and kind of follow the activity until the story of what occurred makes more sense to us. Now, each step of this process is going to give us just more and more pieces. By the end, we should pretty much know how the account was compromised, what access the attacker might have kept, how they might have touched the data, and what security gaps on our side might have made this all possible. Now, before we do any of that, though, we need to make sure that you're set up and kind of get into more details about what is required for this lab. Setup is pretty simple, okay? The main lab is going to run offline, so all you really need is something that can open a spreadsheet file. Excel works, Office Libre, Numbers, Google, whatever you want. There's going to be an optional Python script at the end of this, which basically you don't need to complete this lab, but it's there for a really great second opinion on your findings. If you run it, it'll just pick out basically everything that looks weird or is repetitive or falls into basically the guise of what you should be looking for. Because whenever we use that command, um, I'll kind of show you how it does both on Windows and Mac. It's just going to be less involved than you think it is. So let's start opening up the kit and kind of talk a little bit about that. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is protect the originals, as we said before. After you download the kit, you're going to unzip it, find the case folder. But before you start opening and filtering through the files, you're just going to copy that whole data folder and rename the copy something like data underscore working underscore copy. Uh, you'll do all of that work inside the copy. Now, that might feel like overkill to you, but it is actually a real forensics habit. If you change your original evidence in any way, even by accident, okay, you are creating doubt, not just in the court, but in your company as to how everything happened afterward. So to prevent that from happening, preserve first, investigate second. Once your working copy is basically ready, we can kind of start opening up these files and going into more detail with them. Opening up the files isn't complicated, all right? Most of these are going to be CSV files, so you can just kind of double click them and then open them in whatever automated default spreadsheet app that you might have. The one thing you probably really want to know is just how to turn on the filters so that you can kind of start looking through this data and seeing if you can kind of spot any patterns. The filters usually let you sort through time, narrowing down accounts or any specific field names that are on that folder that you might be able to ascertain the meaning of. Now, for the timeline, you're going to pretty much to create a timeline. You're going to sort through event underscore time from oldest to newest. Once you do that, the file is going to stop looking like a wall of data and it's actually going to read more like a story, like how I talked about before. And before we go deeper on that story, there is basically one other skill that I think we're going to need, which is opening up the command window. Now, I'm not going to pretend that everybody knows everything. That's why these labs exist. So we're just, if you've opened up a command window before, you can kind of speed past this bit, but let's kind of get into and talk about it. So basically, a command window sounds a lot scarier than it is. It's basically just a box where you type in one line and press enter, and it does stuff. All right. On Windows, you can open the lab folder, click the address bar, type PowerShell, and press enter. On a Mac, you can kind of open the terminal, type CD with a space after it, and then drag the lab folder into the terminal window and press enter. That'll both take you to where you need to be. The reason why you need to be there is just because that puts you in the right folder so that you can run certain scripts and see information if you want it to be printed out in the terminal. Now, we're going to use that for pretty much one thing first before we get into the details, which is just checking that the evidence is intact in the first place upon receiving. Now, this is how we verify those files. Basically, each file has a hash, which is basically just a digital fingerprint. If the file changes, even by a little bit, the fingerprint is going to change with that. So what we're going to do is run the command on the slide, compare the result to the hash manifest, and then make sure that the file still matches. That's going to give us confidence that we are working from clean and reliable evidence. So once we trust those files and run this stuff, we can basically start investigating. Now, the timeline, as we mentioned before, is going to be our map of sorts. You're going to open up that file that I see up there and basically sort the events from oldest to newest, kind of like how we mentioned before. Once we do that, we're going to basically just start reading. The first thing that you are going to look for is stuff that feels wrong. Maybe that is a login attempt, maybe it's a strange IP address, maybe, it's pretty much anything, just anything that feels weird or you're seeing repetitively. Once you find something suspicious, basically what you're going to do is write down three things: the time, the account, and the IP address. That little note is basically going to be the thread that we are slowly pulling on this whole lab. Now, once we get to pull in our string, what we're going to want to know is whether one account keeps showing up. So what we'll do for that is look at the account column, filter by account, or use a pivot table if you're more comfortable with that. The goal, nonetheless, is just to count which account appears the most and why this might be suspicious activity. Because usually the loudest account or the account that we are seeing the most frequently is either going to be a automated process that we have built into our system, or it's going to be someone doing some stuff that they aren't supposed to do. In any case, most of that just kind of points back to our one finance volunteer, and you'll kind of see that when you start looking in this stuff. So once you kind of connect all of those ideas together, the one question starts to become what actually happened to the compromised account, if there is one. To answer that, we open the sign in activity file and kind of filter down to the suspected account. We're going to look for a pattern. You may see a bunch of failed logins and some suddenly one successful. You may see a new country, a strange IP, an unmanaged device, or even, something like a client that just doesn't look normal for that user. They're like, I don't think they have a Dell. I'm pretty sure we assigned them a Mac, like things like that. Now, the thing that you're also going to pay attention to, and what I feel like these days is a lot of cause for issue: MFA. A login passing MFA, guys, does not automatically mean that that person was ever actually there. I know we try to bake in MFA as like this, it solves all of our problems, but it doesn't, okay? Attackers can still get around MFA, even the most phishing resistant things that we call MFA. Um, and we can do this in a variety of ways. Fatigue attacks, if you want to look into that. Phishing, as we know. Token theft, if you want to look into that. Or, my favorite is just tricking the user into approving something. You just call them and go, hey, can you approve this? And people are like, okay. And then they'll do it. Because people are simple creatures and we create complicated systems, which means simple and complicated don't go together. And that's just what it is. If you want to make better systems, I highly encourage it, but I am not a complete software engineer and I can't change the fate of the world. All right. So there's that. Now, what you're going to do after you check all of this stuff is just basically figure out how the attacker kept access, which we are going to talk about in this next slide. Now, this is where our rogue app comes in. You might have heard me mention it before. What we're going to do, go back to that timeline and search for consent. Basically, you're going to look for an app around the approval event, especially one involving permissions like reading email, reading files, or keeping access after the user is logged out. That last one matters a lot because if an attacker gets app consent with persistent access, then changing the password isn't even going to fully kick them out, all right? The app can keep working in the background. So the attacker, in this sense, didn't really just get into the account once. They have basically created a little pipe that they can kind of go in and out of. But that was not really the only persistent method that you're going to see in this. So we'll kind of talk about that other one. Now, if you go to the mailbox and you start kind of opening that up and looking at the mailbox rules and the forwarding file, you're going to find this quiet little trick that is hiding in the inbox. Basically, there is a forwarding rule sending finance mail to an outside address, and it also marks messages as read so that the user is less likely to notice what is going on. That is like what you call mailbox persistence. Now, the attacker basically doesn't need to keep logging in after the inbox is already feeding the information, kind of like in that previous example. What they're going to do is watch the invoices, payment conversations, and try to get as much vendor detail from the outside as possible. Now that we kind of know how that is connected, we can kind of figure out what they accessed and why there were certain pulls for information. So for data access, what we're going to do is look in two places. We're going to do mailbox activity and SharePoint activity. In the mailbox API access file, you're going to look for mail items accessed through graph. In the SharePoint file activity, you're going to search for terms like donor, bank, ACH, and confidential. That's going to tell us what the attacker was looking for and what they actually managed to download. In this case, they have touched some donor and banking related fields, and that is a pretty bad news sitch because nobody likes having their money and identity stolen. Okay. Now, the slightly better news out of this is that one external sharing attempt was blocked. So the controls didn't completely fail, but they also did not completely compromise early enough. That is going to lead us to this bigger question, which is why could a volunteer account reach this much data in the first place? That is where identity and access management matters, my IAM girlies and boys. Now, what you're going to do is open the IAM snapshot and look at the suspected volunteer account, all right? We're going to talk about and see what groups they're in, what data they can reach, what kind of MFA do they have? Are there approvals restricted? Did confidential access actually apply? Like, there's a bunch of different things, but this is basically where the breach turns into a lesson. Now, the compromised account was pretty bad, but the real damage came from their blast radius. Because if you look at all of their stuff, a temporary finance volunteer had access to move way more than what they needed. And once that account is compromised, the attacker inherits that access. So the real difference between, one account got phished and sudden, all of our stuff got stolen is usually that safe area of making sure that we're not giving more access than what people need. Why, if one person can get into your organization and ruin everything, then they have way too much power as to what they can and can't do. And you need to be able to limit that in a safe way, or at least put more protections around it so that when it does happen, you can confine them to one specific area. Now, before we get ending all of this, we are going to write our final memo, and there is kind of one shortcut you can try before we get to it. Now, I talked about earlier a helper script that you can run. Now, the helper script is optional, okay? It is not there to replace your investigation. It is just there to give you a quick comparison point. Basically, to run this, you're going to just check that Python is installed, open a command window in the lab folder, and run the command that you see on the slide. The script is basically going to create a output folder with a quick summary of suspicious accounts and IPs. If your findings may, match the script, basically great, if they do not, maybe go back and figure out why. Either way, the goal is pretty much the same. Understand the evidence, not just the answer, and put it all together. That is the final step here, an incident memo. So what you're going to do for incident memos is try to keep the information as plain as possible. You do not need to sound fancy. You just need to be direct and you need to be clear. You're going to explain what happened, which account was compromised, and how the attacker might have maintained access. There's also a bunch of other details you'll see included in there. Just make sure that you're following the template. But after all that, there is only one takeaway from this whole lab. So it is this: the breach matters, okay? But the blast radius decides exactly how bad it gets. So make sure that you're locking down accounts and doing as much as you can to make it a non-eventful night. That's it for the whole lab, all right? The kit, the commands, the answer key, and the resources are basically all going to be linked in the description and pinned in the comments below. I'll also include some deeper reading from Microsoft, CISA, and Mitra if you want to keep learning. But if there's, some warmness in your heart this month, um, I'll put the LGBTQ support organizations in the description. You'll see them because that part, that human aspect of what we do, matters just as much as the technical. And this lab might be about cybersecurity, but it is also ultimately what we do is about protecting the communities that already have enough risk offline. So, again, thank you so much for watching. If this helped, like, subscribe, share it with somebody who might want to learn digital forensics, IAM, or just learn about nonprofit security. Uh, Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and have a happy Pride. I'll see you guys in the next one.